This is HR in Review, a podcast dedicated to HR thought leadership, actionable advice, and all the latest developments in human resource management.
Managing HR when based in one country can be complicated, but when you're looking to expand internationally, education and compliance are absolutely essential. Hey, this is Bill Banham, your guest host of the HR in Review podcast, and in this episode, we're going to look at ways to close that gap. My guest joining me today is Michelle Forster, Managing Director over at Tricord Solutions HR, a company helping businesses through complex M&A, TUPE and redundancy processes to ensure fair and rigorous procedures are followed to help mitigate employment tribunal exposure. Hey, Michelle, welcome to the show today.
Thank you, Bill. It's lovely to be here.
So, Michelle, beyond my reintroduction there, why don't you start by taking a minute or two and telling our listeners a bit more about yourself? Don't get into Tricord just yet. We'll speak about that in just a moment.
Sure, that's not a problem. Okay, so I'm Michelle Forster. I'm a Brit born and raised. I was raised in Clapham in South London. For those South Londoners out there, they'll appreciate that. I have grew up my whole life in London, but I've actually spent most of my adult life out of the UK, and I've lived abroad in multiple countries for about 19 years.
Excellent. And we were chatting before we hit record today. Those places included beautiful Colorado, and I believe you said DC, which is another awesome place to be. I'm very jealous. They are fantastic locations. Okay, yes. Now let's absolutely right. Let's now talk a little bit about Tricord. Can you give our audience a bit of an overview of the business and what you guys get up to?
Of course. So Tricord has actually a bit of personal meaning for myself. So I've got 3 kids, and so a part of Tricord is a sort of like a nod to my 3 children. The other thing about Tricord and why I named it Tricord is that whenever you're working as a consultant, as an independent consultant, you come in to bridge the gap very often between the employer and the employee. So I look at being that bridge, and hence came up with the name Tricord. Now, Tricord Solutions HR is an HR solutions focused consultancy that supports any UK business with outsourced HR. So it could be anything from your basic contracts to handbooks, whatever. But because I've been in HR for, it feels like donkey's years, I'm not even going to tell you how many, but it's more than 20, a little bit less than 30. I have done multiple mergers and acquisitions, restructuring, redundancies, mergers and acquisitions, and very often sometimes complex, highly sensitive disciplinaries and grievances, and sometimes very sensitive and highly difficult employee exits. And then, but I also do international HR, as you spoke to, Bill, at the beginning of the podcast. And I help any company in any country move and expand into another country, and that helps them. And I help them with that legal entity setup, local employment contracts, local handbooks, and then getting the business off to a great start.
Follow us on Twitter at HR Review, or join us on LinkedIn and Facebook.
What are some of the big challenges for HR departments when a company is looking to expand into new jurisdictions?
So education and compliance are key when you want to expand into new jurisdiction. Very often, a lot of companies will try and sort of go into a country under the radar, but I think it causes a huge amount of problems for them. One of the things I found, especially with US, UK companies, is that they will go in and think that they can go under a UK or a US contract and employ someone in that jurisdiction, but they're already illegal in that country. So the norm is that whenever you employ someone in a country, even if they're an expat moving into that country, and it's not 100% across the board, but I'd say about 95%, they have to have a local in-country employment contract that legally abides by the labour laws in that country. And then as part of that, they also have to abide by the local policies and procedures in that country. And they can't just do it the way they did in their home country, because that can open them up to exposure in that country. A lot of countries, especially in Europe, are governed by collective bargaining agreements. And those collective bargaining agreements determine that employment relationship. And if you don't abide by those local collective bargaining agreements, you can get yourself into a lot of trouble.
If you enjoy the HR in Review podcast, please consider giving us a 5-star rating in iTunes or in your podcast app of choice. This helps others find us and grow our community of HR and related professionals.
What does that look like? What sort of trouble can you get into?
So some of the things that you can get into trouble with is so I look at, this is going to make you chuckle, but it's very, very relevant. I look at the most important thing any employer should have is an employment contract. Why? Because an employment contract almost acts like a prenup. When you get married, everything is lovely, hunky-dory, honeymoons and unicorns. But when it comes time to divorce, it brings out the worst in people. And it's very often similar in that employment relationship. So when you first onboard somebody into the organization, you need a solid contract in place, because what it does is it makes the employer and the employee behave. It helps them to know where they stand legally and what they are responsible for and what they are not responsible for. And then if it comes time to exit that employee for whatever reason, because you have a good, strong employment contract in place, then everybody abides by the rules most of the time. And the exit is often amicable, even if it's an unfriendly exit or an unhappy exit, it ends up amicably just because you have a contract in place which determines the rules around that exit. And it mitigates a huge amount of risk, and it mitigates a huge amount of hostility as well. Now, when this comes to, now just to sort of move forward a bit again and answer your question about what's the issues around collective bargaining agreements in those countries. So often when employers go into a country and they go in blind and they don't get the right education or the right support to enter into that country, and maybe they don't have a legally compliant contract, if they upset the employee in any way, shape or form, all the employee has to do is make a call to their local works council. Think of it in the UK like a trade union, and say, my employer has done this, whether or not it's true. Then that works council, if I just want to be blunt, can make the employer's life hell. And that employer can also get blacklisted in that country depending on the situation. And if that employer or that company gets blacklisted in that country, for them to continue to do business is going to be very, very difficult. For them to even recruit is going to be very, very difficult. So it's really important. When I'm working with countries, say they want to go into France, I think France is one of the most complicated countries to enter into, but it's also one of the greatest. When you're going to enter into a company, when you're going to go and open up a subsidiary in France, you have to abide by the collective bargaining agreements. That determines certain portions of the employment contract. It also has to be reflected and determined in the employment handbook. And I have very good relationships with works councils in multiple countries. I will go in and I'll bring them into that relationship with the company, bring them into that relationship with the organization, so that even if the company makes a mistake, because we've already built that relationship with the works council, we can then turn around and say to them, look, we've messed up. Please, can you help us rectify it? Please, can you help us do the best and the right by this employee or the situation? And the works councils are more than happy, because you built that relationship from the get-go, to sort of step in and say, okay, you should have done this, but let's help you get back on track. And then that preserves the relationship of the company, preserves the relationship with the employer. And you move forward in a very, I think, productive and very healthy way.
I appreciate that you work more with the corporate side of things, with leadership, with HR departments and whatnot. But for employees, Michelle, looking to transfer to a new territory, so I'm thinking here, for example, the intra-company transfers. What are typical legal and compliance issues that they and their families, of course, because they'll be going with them? What are some of those that they face?
So the most important thing when, for example, if you're talking about an intercompany transfer, which is normally the norm when you're transferring into another country, you've gotten a job with someone. So if you're moving to the US, so then the most important thing is that work sponsorship, that work visa. So the employer will have to sponsor your work permit, and then you apply for that work permit. And so it can be quite a long, rigorous process in whichever country you're going into, and some can be relatively quick. But the most important thing is, if you as a single person transferring to another country, you have to have the work permit in place. If you're a family with dependents, then you also have to think about many other things when you're transferring over. So you have to think about the culture that you're walking into. And this is just from a very practical standpoint myself, because I'm a mum with kids, is that you have to think about what catchment area, what school are your kids going to go to, not just the company that you're walking into. You also have to know that also, if you're, for example, if you're going to move to the States with your family's estate into the States, you have to abide by the work permit. You have to also abide by the fact that you're being governed by the new employment rules in that country. So in the US, it's an employment at will country, which means they can hire and fire at any time. So you don't have the protection of redundancy that you would if you were coming from the UK. So it's really important to be aware of those intricacies when you're entering into that country. There could be benefits that are compulsory in that country. So most countries, not all, but most countries have a compulsory pension plan. A lot of them, not all of them, have a mandatory private healthcare plan, just as a sort of high-end look overview of it. So when you're moving into that country, you have to make sure that you comply with the statutory benefits and that you'll benefit as an employee from those benefits. And then also, if you're moving into that country, how would you, does the company that you're working with, do they have relocation services to help you move into that country? Do they help you find a property? Do they help you find the right schools? Do they help you move into the right area? And I also think that a lot of companies don't give a cultural debrief, especially for expats into that country. Like, as a Brit, when I first moved over to the US back in 1999, it was such a massive culture shock for me, because there is a different level of directness. So, for example, in the UK, we can be quite, we're very polite in how we interact with each other in the workplace, very professional. In the US, they can be very, very direct in their conversation with you and very to the point. They don't necessarily, it's not going to sound right, but it doesn't necessarily come under the umbrella of politeness. They're just direct. And it's not that they're trying to be rude, it's just their culture and the way that they work with you. And so you kind of have to get your head around that and understand and not take it personally and, do your job. And also, again, you have to understand that the annual leave in multiple countries can be very different to your own. Again, in the US, annual leave can be 5 to 10 days per year for a standard employment contract. And if you've come from somewhere like the UK, where you get, 28 days with public holidays, that could be very hard for you to then go to a country which only gives you 10 working days annual leave per year. Did that cover?
But I agree with everything you said there. Although my philosophy on this is always, you get paid more in the US. You might get less holidays, but you get the opportunity to make more money. It depends on what's important and where you are in your career and where in your life. I think both have got benefits and disadvantages. And I'd love to have another conversation with you another time about the different cultures in the UK and the US. 85% of my business is out of the US, Michelle. I actually find them way more polite than working with Brits generally, but we don't have time for that today. So let's continue through. You help guide companies through the disciplinary and grievance process, of course, and if applicable, if the employee has potential of being exited from that business, what are some of the key steps to take to minimize risk and support employers in conducting a fair, equitable and legally compliant process? Of course, you spoke earlier about having a contract in place, but beyond that, what are some of those other pieces?
So again, I think this is why I think a handbook is so key to any company, any organization, because it acts as your standard operating procedures for that company. So what that means is, so for example, you have to go through a disciplinary and grievance process. If you don't have a policy in place, an employee can do what they want. That's not fair to any employee. And then the employee doesn't know where they stand. But if you have a policy in place, a disciplinary and grievance policy in place, then the employer has to abide by their own policy, as does the employee. So it gives them, so how does that help you mitigate risk? If you follow your own disciplinary and grievance procedure and put those steps in place, if the employee was then determined that they would have to be exited from the organization, then the likelihood of it going to a tribunal is significantly lower than if you didn't follow your own practice and your own policy in the first place. It mitigates risk, it mitigates exposure. And I think that's invaluable for any organisation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Michelle, the next two questions I've got for you are questions that we ask all of our guests on the HR in Review podcast. Okay, so don't worry if you feel like you want to repeat some pieces that you've mentioned before. That's okay. We cut up these answers and we use them in different ways and whatnot. So first of those two is, if you could pass on one crucial lesson that you've learned in your career in 1 minute or less, what, Bill? That's impossible. What would be your top tip for HR pros and leaders? Go.
I think the most important thing from my own experience, is just to keep a calm head, because very often HR brought into crisis situations. And because I've seen several of those in my career, you just learn that you just go in, and it's actually really important to bring down the temperature in the room and bring in a very balanced perspective, look at what's going on and just keep calm. And, HR professionals, we're problem solvers. So there's no problem that's not insurmountable. And I think that when you go through so many years of experience, there's a different understanding that you bring into that room when you're going in there to deal with that situation. And I think that that's invaluable experience that I've learned over my career.
Why not subscribe to the premium version of HR in Review? You'll get ad-free content, early and extra episodes and more. Even better, although it's the premium edition, it's absolutely free. Sign up at hrreview.co.uk/podcast.
Well, I think you did that in about 55 seconds. Good work. Good work. Okay. Next of the two standard questions that we ask of all of our guests is as follows. What is the single biggest change, Michelle, that you think will happen in HR and leadership over the next 5 to 10 years?
I actually think I'm going to answer this very differently. So I don't necessarily think it's about change in HR and change in leadership over the next 5 to 10 years, because at the end of the day, it boils down to, do you have good leadership and do you have good communication and do you look after your people? So I know, like on the current HR forums, you hear lots and lots of things about diversity, equity, inclusion and mental health, for example. But again, when you're looking at these measures that are trying to be achieved, if you don't have good leadership that champions or advocates those causes, good people that administer those changes or those causes, then HR and leadership won't change. It'll stay the same. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but it's all about raising good leaders and being good to your organization, having good communication levels throughout that process. And it's really important as an organization, whether you're big or small, to have trust in your organization. If you don't have trust, then you'll start to see very often unhealthy, internally competitive factors coming into play, where people sort of compete against others. And there's healthiness in that, but there's also a lot of unhealthiness in that. So again, it's the culture of the organization, good leadership, treating your employees well, and trust and communication. That's what I believe anyway.
Rock and roll. And just finally for today, Michelle, how can our listeners connect with you personally? So maybe that's through LinkedIn, maybe you want to share your email address. I bet you're super cool and you're all over TikTok, Instagram and places. And of course, how can they learn more about Tricord too?
So it would be awesome if you wanted to visit my website, which is tricordsolutionshr.com. Or if you actually even wanted to contact me, you can get me at michelle@tricord-solutions.com, and it would be amazing to hear from you.
Excellent. Well, that just leaves me to say for today, and I feel like you and I can have many more conversations in the future, Michelle. But for today, thank you very much for being my guest on this episode of the HR in Review pod.
You're very welcome, Bill.
The HR in Review podcast is brought to you by hrreview.co.uk. hrreview.co.uk is a website dedicated to human resources and related professionals. News items are posted daily, together with analysis looking in depth at topical HR issues. You can sign up for our range of specialist newsletters at hrreview.co.uk/sign-up and follow us on Twitter at hrreview, or join us on LinkedIn and Facebook. Thank you for listening.